The wind came early that year, sharper than Clara Whitmore remembered from her girlhood, slipping through the cracks of the small Kansas homestead as if it knew exactly where to hurt, rattling the thin window panes and carrying with it the smell of frost and dry earth, a reminder that winter would show no mercy to those unprepared. Clara stood at the rough-hewn wooden table that her husband Daniel had built with his own hands 8 years earlier, running her fingers across the deep grooves left by years of honest work, and tried to steady her breathing as she counted the meager supplies laid out before her. Half a sack of flour sat slumped in the corner like it had given up hope. 3 potatoes, soft at the edges and already sprouting eyes, rested beside a dented tin of beans whose label had long since peeled away, and that was all. That was Thanksgiving. No turkey, no bread, no pie. Just enough food to remind her of everything she could no longer provide. Around the room, 6 children moved quietly, careful not to make noise, as though hunger itself might punish them for being noticed. 12-year-old Samuel sat near the hearth, pretending to whittle a stick, though his hands trembled from more than the cold, his eyes darting to his mother's face again and again, searching for answers she didn't have. 10-year-old Ruth folded and unfolded the same ragged cloth, her lips moving silently as she recited a prayer she'd learned at her father's knee before he'd gone to glory. Little Emma, barely 7, rocked her baby brother Jonah in her arms, humming a soft hymn that wavered with each breath, while 4-year-old Caleb sat on the floor tracing circles in the dust, his stomach growling loud enough that he looked around in embarrassment. Clara felt each sound like a knife. Since Daniel's death 2 winters ago, thrown from a horse spooked by a sudden crack of thunder and crushed before help could arrive, she had learned that silence could scream louder than any cry. The house no longer echoed with his laughter or the heavy thud of his boots by the door. There were no strong arms to split wood, no steady voice to remind her that things would work out. There was only her now, and 6 small lives depending on strength she wasn't sure she had left. She turned toward the stove, blinking hard, refusing to let the children see the tears burn in her eyes. She had prayed through the night, kneeling on the cold floor until her knees ached, asking God for mercy, for provision, for just one sign that her family had not been forgotten. Thanksgiving morning had come anyway, indifferent to her fear, carrying with it the cruel reminder of all they used to have, the full table, Daniel carving the turkey, the children laughing, the warmth of a home that felt safe. Clara swallowed hard and wondered if Faith was supposed to feel this heavy. She had almost decided to tell the children there would be no meal at all, that Thanksgiving would simply be another day to endure, when a sound cut through the wind, faint at first, then unmistakable, the slow creak of wagon wheels crunching over frozen dirt. Clara froze. No one came this way anymore. Neighbors lived miles apart, each fighting their own battles, each stretched thin by drought, sickness, and loss. The children rushed to the window as one, hope flaring dangerously in their eyes, and Clara's heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. She hesitated only a moment before pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders and opening the door. Cold air rushed in, stealing her breath, but beyond it stood a sight she could scarcely believe. On the narrow road before the house was a massive rancher, tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered coat dusted with frost, his beard streaked with gray, his posture steady and unhurried like a man who knew exactly why he had come. Behind him sat a wagon so heavily loaded it sagged in the middle, stacked high with sacks, crates, barrels, and baskets, the edges of fresh bread peeking out from beneath a thick blanket. The children gasped. Clara's knees nearly buckled. The man removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest, his voice low but warm as it carried through the wind. "Ma'am," he said gently, meeting her eyes without pity. "I was told this house could use a Thanksgiving blessing." For a long moment Clara couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred, and all the prayers she had whispered in the dark seemed to rise up at once. She had no idea who this man was or why he had come, only that something holy stood on her doorstep that morning. And as the children stared at the wagon of plenty with mouths open in wonder, Clara felt something she had not dared to feel in 2 long years. Hope, fragile but real, flickering back to life like embers stirred by a careful hand. For a long heartbeat, no one moved, as though the cold itself had frozen the moment in place. Then little Caleb broke free first, slipping past Clara's skirts and stopping at the edge of the porch, his eyes wide as he stared at the towering wagon, while the others followed, cautious but unable to contain their amazement. And Clara suddenly realized how long it had been since her children had looked at anything with pure wonder instead of quiet fear. The rancher introduced himself simply as Thomas Hale, his voice steady and unassuming, explaining nothing more than was necessary, and before Clara could gather herself enough to ask a single question, he stepped past her with the ease of a man used to work and cold mornings, and began untying the ropes that held the wagon's load. One by one he lifted down heavy sacks of flour and cornmeal, setting them gently on the porch as if they were fragile treasures rather than supplies, then crates filled with apples so red and firm they looked like something out of a dream, bundles of smoked meat wrapped in cloth that carried a rich, savory scent Clara had almost forgotten, jars of honey glowing amber in the weak sunlight, crocks of fresh butter, and jugs of milk still cold from the morning air, and with each item placed down, the children's gasps grew louder, their excitement breaking through months of forced restraint. Emma clapped her hands before catching herself looking to her mother for permission to be happy, and when Clara nodded, tears spilling freely now, the sound of laughter filled the yard for the first time since Daniel's passing. Thomas said little as he worked, his movements efficient and respectful, but Clara noticed everything. The way he avoided looking at the children's patched clothes, the way he never once let his eyes linger on the empty cupboards visible through the open door, the way he treated her not as a charity case, but as the head of the household she had become. When he finally lifted down the last items, 2 fat turkeys tied carefully by the legs, and a basket of warm bread wrapped in a wool blanket, the smell alone brought Clara's knees close to giving out, and she pressed a hand to the doorframe to steady herself, whispering, almost in shame, that she could not pay him, that she had nothing to offer in return. Thomas straightened slowly, meeting her gaze with calm certainty, and shook his head. "This wasn't brought to be paid for," he said. "It was brought to be shared." The words struck her harder than any sermon ever had. Together they carried the food inside, the children helping where they could, their small arms struggling with Loa. That would have been impossible for them weeks earlier, but they carried them anyway, proud to be part of something good. The house transformed as the supplies filled every corner, the once bare table now heavy with abundance, the stove fed with wood. Thomas split himself without being asked, and soon the kitchen warmed with more than heat, it filled with life. Clara found herself cooking without counting, measuring without fear, seasoning without worry, and as the turkeys roasted and bread was broken, the smells wrapped around her heart and loosened something that had been clenched tight for far too long. When they finally sat down to eat, the children waiting until she bowed her head, Clara prayed aloud, her voice shaking as she thanked God not only for the food before them, but for the reminder that kindness still walked the earth, sometimes wearing a weathered coat and arriving on creaking wheels. As they ate, Thomas watched quietly, his expression unreadable but gentle, and Clara realized this meal was not just filling bellies, it was restoring dignity, mending spirits, and teaching her children a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. That even in the hardest seasons, generosity could still arrive unannounced and change everything. As the last plates were cleared and the children drifted into a rare, contented sleep, some curled together near the hearth, and others tucked beneath patched quilts that felt warmer than they had in years, the house settled into a deep, peaceful hush, broken only by the soft crackle of firewood, and Clara found herself sitting across from Thomas at the small table, the glow of the flames painting long shadows on the walls Daniel once mended with his own hands. Outside, the wind still howled, but it no longer felt like an enemy pressing in. It felt distant, as though the world had paused to give them space. Thomas removed his coat and set it carefully aside, revealing hands roughened by years of labor, hands that had known both building and burying, and after a long silence that neither rushed to fill, he spoke quietly of his own loss, telling Clara about his wife Margaret, how she had laughed easily, and believed fiercely in helping those who had less, how sickness had taken her slowly, cruelly, leaving him alone in a house far too quiet, and how the ache of waking each morning without her never truly faded, only changed shape. Clara listened, her chest tight, recognizing every word without needing to interrupt, and when she finally spoke, her own story poured out. The terror of that day Daniel never came home, the sound of the neighbor's knock on the door, the way her knees gave out when she saw the look on his face, the long nights afterward when she held her children close and wondered how love could hurt so much and still be worth it. Thomas didn't offer advice or empty comfort, he simply listened, his presence steady, his understanding unspoken but complete, and in that shared silence, Clara felt something begin to loosen inside her, a knot of grief she had carried alone for too long. He told her that after Margaret's death, he had nearly lost himself to bitterness, until he remembered her words, how she used to say no one should ever face hunger or sorrow alone if there was something you could do about it, and so he began watching, asking quietly, listening for houses where the light had gone dim, where the laughter had faded, and bringing what he could, without fanfare or expectation. "It's how I keep her close," he said simply, staring into the fire. Clara realized then that the wagon had carried far more than food. It had carried a legacy of love, a refusal to let loss have the final word. As the fire burned low and the children stirred softly in their sleep, Thomas stood, placing his hat back on his head, promising he would check on them again before winter deepened. And as Clara watched him step into the night, she felt a warmth settle over her heart that had nothing to do with the fire, a quiet understanding that while grief had shaped them both, it had not destroyed them, and that sometimes healing didn't come as thunder or miracles, but as a gentle reminder that someone else had walked the same dark road and survived. Winter came hard after that Thanksgiving, but it no longer came empty, and Clara felt the change not just in the full pantry or the steady warmth of the stove, but in the way her children slept through the night without hunger curling their bodies tight, in the way laughter slowly returned to the house like a cautious guest, relearning its welcome. Thomas kept his word, arriving every few weeks with supplies, tools, and quiet help that never made Clara feel small, repairing fences, teaching Samuel how to split wood properly, showing Ruth how to keep accounts, and kneeling patiently with the younger ones as if time itself bent more gently around him. As the months passed, Clara found herself standing taller, her hands steadier, her prayers filled less with desperation and more with gratitude. And when spring finally broke the ground open, Thomas helped her plant a real garden, rose neat and hopeful beneath the sun, promising that the land, like people, responded to care given faithfully. The children flourished alongside it, cheeks filling out, voices growing stronger, their eyes bright with something Clara had feared they might lose forever, belief in tomorrow. There were no sudden declarations or dramatic promises between Clara and Thomas, only shared work, shared meals, shared understanding, and a growing sense that God had woven their broken paths together not by accident, but by design. One quiet morning, as green shoots pushed through the soil and birds returned to the trees, Clara realized Thanksgiving had never been about a single meal. It had been the moment her faith was answered not with riches, but with community, dignity, and love that asked for nothing in return. The harvest that year was abundant, not just in crops, but in healing, in strength, in the certainty that kindness multiplies when it is given freely. And as Clara watched her children run through the fields, their laughter carried on the wind, she understood that the wagon of plenty had changed more than their circumstances. It had changed their future, proving that even after loss, even after hunger, hope can arrive quietly and stay. If this story moved you, inspired you, or restored even a small piece of your faith in humanity, subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be the one that changes a heart, just like this one did.